Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Counterterrorism. Today, I'm Etai Handman, and I'm the host of the premier podcast for the ICT, the International Institute for Counterterrorism. And today we have a very special episode. We are joined by one of my favorite guests to ever come onto the show many of times, retired Colonel Miri. She's a fellow at the International Institute for Counterterrorism here at the IDC in Herzliya. Colonel Eisen, how are you doing today?
Shalom, Chag Sameach. It's wonderful in this time of the Passover break.
It is a wonderful Passover as we sort of may be seeing the end of a pandemic, see the light at the end of the tunnel, especially here in Israel as the vaccinations seem to be working. We haven't seen a real rise in many cases over the last little while, and hopefully keep our fingers crossed that that continues through the holiday period and into the summer, and maybe Israel can reopen, at least for its citizens, in normal fashion. And we hope that you are staying safe during this pandemic and health crisis.
One of the most amazing things I think this year when we were sitting at a Seder is that Etai, we had the opportunity here in Israel to do a full family Seder where everybody was vaccinated. And what I can say from avdut lecherut, from slavery to freedom, and it's not slavery, the pandemic, but that sense of freedom, of being with family, of having that today in Israel was a wonderful thankfulness. And I can just hope that everybody listening to us, it'll get there. You'll all get there soon too.
Yes, we hope the world goes back to as much as normal as possible. And we hope and wish for everyone around the world to be vaccinated and safe and healthy. Today's program, we're going to be focusing a little bit about Iran, the way that it has stretched out its tentacles across the Middle East, through land, through air, through sea. We have seen them use whatever means at their disposal to disrupt the economy, the stability, and everything else that goes on here in the Middle East, be it their Gulf neighbors, be it all the way to the Mediterranean, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, what they've done in Iraq, especially with their forces vis-a-vis, or militias, if you will, vis-a-vis American bases, using the tactics that we have seen them employ in Gaza, using rockets to attack Israeli civilians or Israeli bases. So before we get into anything specific, maybe you can give us a little bit of an overview of what has happened in Iran, what has shifted in their mindset that has allowed them to play offense in this way in the Middle East.
Well, like with many things, it's not just one aspect, it's a combination, meaning it's both the Abraham Accords that happened over a period, a process during 2020, during the pandemic, where from the Iranian perspective, Israel now has an official, legitimate leg in the Persian Gulf, something that we never had before. That's a big change for them. And that happened under the auspices of the former American US administration. That makes a difference, both Bahrain and the Emirates themselves, and that sense that probably there's more going on, maybe with Saudi Arabia, maybe with some of the other Gulf countries, officially and unofficially, like Oman. But in addition to that, there was the change that happened in the US administration. There's something of here, let's try and play how is this new administration going to respond to what we've been doing for many years as Iran, our spreading out instability and helping out. But that's just two things, meaning Israel in the Gulf and the change in US administration. The third one that we don't always connect to, but it has to do with it, is elections in Iran proper that are going to take place in a couple months' time. And just like anywhere else, elections, domestic elections, you want to make a statement. And one of the statements they want to make to their domestic crowd, to the people who vote in those elections for the president, is these are the priorities: the nuclear priority, the Shiite export priority, the anti-Israel priority, and so on and so forth. So those things together are what have changed.
You've mentioned quite a bit in there, and I'd love to unpack it and go over all of it with you. But something that really stood out to me, and I think a lot of people that don't necessarily have in-depth knowledge of the situation in the Middle East, in-depth knowledge of Iran and how it reacts and why it does what it does, are asking themselves, while they understand that Iran is not necessarily happy with the Abraham Accords and Israel having a legitimate foot in the Gulf, friendly with Bahrain, friendly with UAE, full-on accords and business, et cetera, I think a lot of people don't understand where or why there isn't more Western pushback or Western help towards the Abraham Accords, because this is something that the West has dreamed about, Israel and its Arab neighbors being friendly, peace, economics, et cetera, trade between the countries, knowing that, if you will, the big evil in the Middle East is Iran, and they are upset about these Abraham Accords. Why wouldn't you see a bigger pushback from the West in the sense of backing up the UAE, backing up Israel in these accords?
Well, again, things haven't happened disconnected. And it isn't about the fact that it was the former administration that did the Abraham Accords, but let's put it into context. They both did the Abraham Accords. They also left the nuclear agreement with Iran a few years before that. That happened also. So just to add that into the spice, because the accords themselves have to do with Israel in the Middle East, with Israel and its neighbors. And that is an incredibly important push, but in its own way, by doing so, it was also putting a stand opposite Iran. But again, things can't be disconnected. Right after that happened, elections in the United States, a change of government in the United States, and very clearly, and I'm not yet saying good or bad, I'm just saying very clear difference in policy when it comes towards Iran and its nuclear aspirations. And it was the United States of America who left those accords. You can have whatever opinion you want about the nuclear accords. It was the US administration that left, not Iran. And I'm not saying Iran was doing well. I'm just saying in the area around that is also taken into account. But I want to add one more thing in that Iranian perspective, because from the Iranian perspective, and it's funny because we don't think of it in that way, Israel is surrounding Iran because suddenly we're in the Gulf. Bahrain and UAE and Oman, for that matter, and maybe under the surface Saudi Arabia, because we can fly over Saudi Arabia. But in the north, the Stan countries that border Iran, Israel has a strong relationship with Azerbaijan that borders Iran, and the Azeris and Iranians have a challenging kind of relationship. So from their point of view, that was like, oh, look, they're all around.
So there's a dual fear in that sense. Israel looks at Iran as trying to surround it with its proxies in Gaza, proxies and rockets stationed in Iraq, what they're doing in Syria and Golan, and obviously Hezbollah on the Lebanese front. And don't put it past them to try to do something on the Eastern Front from Jordan or in the West Bank. But so it is a little bit of a dual fear situation. So how do we look at it and maybe de-escalate that situation? What do world powers, what does Israel, what does Iran need to do in combination with one another, obviously, to de-escalate and sort of show, okay, you have your friends, we have our friends, they happen to be backdoor neighbors to you?
If there was one recipe to be able to de-escalate, that if we just would follow the correct amounts and put them together, and ta-da, we'd have de-escalation. Etai, you and me probably wouldn't be in the Institute for Counterterrorism that brings out these issues so strongly, because there are different forces that pull in different ways. There is no recipe, and it very much has to do with how we, Israel, the government in Israel, and remember, we're also possibly about to be in a change of government. I don't know. You don't know. We don't know.
Could be
But
another
this also
elections.
will impact it. Who knows, right? So, taking that into account, let's look at three different aspects of what you just brought up. Israel may be changing government, but in any case, even if it does or doesn't, there are differing opinions in Israel on how to address the Iranian threat, the nuclear threat, the expansion, the terror export threat, because terror export and nuclear are not the exact same thing. Nuclear capabilities have their own standalone aspects. When it combines with terror export that they've been doing for the last 30 years, these are challenging for Israel, but they're different opinions. Do you engage with them? Do you not engage with them? Do you engage with them even when you think they lie? Oh, because everybody else tells the truth all the time? I'm giving you some of the challenges just here. The new US administration has already openly stated that they will engage. They haven't yet said how. They haven't said we're going to go back to the agreement that was on the table and signed in 2015, that agreement that the Trump administration left. I don't know, but it's out there. When they engage the new US administration, are they going to come back and say, we're going back to what was? I personally doubt that, but I don't know what the new configuration would be. And then you add in Iran. Iran would love to go back to that agreement, 2015, the one that they agreed to sign, the one that Israel was so against for a variety of reasons, the one that Trump left. And I don't want to give, the situation so everybody goes, that's the recipe. But Iran wants to come back to the table because it wants the sanctions to be lifted. The question, and that is in my old-fashioned way, the $64,000 question, it's worth way more than that, is what combination will bring both the United States and Iran back to the table? All of the other powers right now I'm putting aside, the China and the Russia and the EU or the UN. Right now, what I'm interested in, the two ones that really have to change are the US, and they've said that they'll change. But Iran has to come back to the table. And I cannot give a clear-cut bottom line of how they're going to come back to the table. But I do think that many of what we've seen over the last few months of an upgrading, of attacks against oil facilities, against Israeli boats, or more correctly, Israeli businessmen-owned boats, but against Saudi sites and Yemenite sites inside Iraq, things that are going on, Syria, Hezbollah, Lebanon, that all of these are part of Iran's answer to their coming back to the table, which is saying, we're here, we're not leaving any of these assets that we've accumulated over these last few years. Now come and sit at the table with us. I don't know what the American answer will be.
You brought up some very interesting points there, and one I wanted to get to, and we'll touch on it, I think, near the end of our conversation, is the latest pact between China and Iran and how that affects everything. But you did mention specifically some stuff I wanted to touch on already at this point. One was the attacks against Saudi facilities. Two, we are hearing reports of tit-for-tat attacks between Israel and Iran on shipping containers. Iran claiming Israel's attacking oil tankers in the Middle East. We're hearing reports of 11, 12 times this has happened. And we know that, not definitively yet, but we know that Iran attacked a cargo ship of Israel's. And we also know that they attacked a cargo ship full of oil that created that big Mediterranean oil spill just a while ago. What has changed in the narrative between nations? What are the unwritten codes of attacking now business interests, tankers in the middle of the sea, when we know that attacking an oil tanker in the middle of the sea has many repercussions? Obviously, it doesn't get the oil to its destination. The people that sent the oil aren't getting financially compensated. But a spill of that magnitude in the Mediterranean has such magnificent effects on wildlife, ecosystems, economies, everything around them. So what has changed in the unwritten rules of war, if you will, that has led to both of these countries right now attacking business interests and cargo ships?
So I'm gonna take what you said and finesse it a bit for our audience. Let's be clear. We say Israel, we're talking about government and official Israel.
Correct.
When we say Iran, we're talking about the Islamic regime, the Revolutionary Guard, not the Iranian military in that sense. Okay.
No, yeah,
I'm saying that because it's not the 85 million Iranian, Persian speaking, mainly Iranian people. And I want to do that distinction because I think that's part of the difference. We do have an elected government that we elect and elect and elect, and we actually don't have an elected government. Okay, I'm just reminding ourselves that we didn't have for a while. The first and second of these four elections brought results that continued the governments that were from before. The third elections resulted in an Israeli government where the prime minister and the defense minister are from two very much competing parties. Do you think that affects our security stand? And I'm going to go, really? Of course it must. They don't agree on that view of where the policy should go. Some aspects are under the direct aspect of the prime minister. Are you going to do things in Israel without the knowledge of the defense minister? There are politics going on all sides of the Atlantic, of the Mediterranean. We're not in the Atlantic. And I add in that because of the Abraham Accords, certainly for the first time openly from August, September, October of 2020, we're only at the end of March 2021, it's less than 6 months. You have Israeli business ships that, by the way, they're not Israeli. They're owned by Israeli businessmen who live in Great Britain or in France or in the Bahamas or in Panama, but Iran is targeting them as Israeli targets. And here I would say that nothing has changed, but in our venue of counterterrorism, the International Institute for Counterterrorism, what's written right behind you, Etai, okay, in that sense, is that Iran uses terror all of the time, meaning they attack free-floating business ships owned by an Israeli. What does that have to do in that sense with Israel or the government? They're not trying to attack us. They're trying to attack anything that says Israel, meaning they'll attack a building that has a Star of David. They will attack a Jewish building, and just like Hezbollah did in Argentina and Iran would do, you do it anywhere. And right now it's suddenly gotten closer. It's as if more in their face, they need to do so. When it comes to what's going on in the Mediterranean Sea, murkier, both because of the oil and the spills, harder to challenge. Israel has not said officially that Israel did so. There are claims in different ways. It's about a politics. What it was an officially owned Iranian tanker going to Syria. That's not allowed. That's not allowed, meaning it's illegal plus illegal. I don't see them as being within the same parameters. But in that sense, if Iran goes all out and thinks it can attack anything that has to do with Israel, because that's a legit kind of target, then perhaps very clear going against international law of what's happening in the Mediterranean, of supplying illegal oil to illegal countries in such a way may not pass unnoticed. And I know I'm being a little oblique, but I hope that we all understood what I meant.
No, very much understood what you meant. And I think you put it in very finite terms there and explained it extremely well to anyone that doesn't understand that there is a major difference between attacking an Israeli business-owned enterprise, like you said, an Israeli businessman that lives in London and owns a cargo shipping company or ship or whatever it may be, versus attacking a ship carrying illegal arms, illegal commodities being shipped to a state where there are sanctions on these things and sanctions on the state that is shipping this contraband.
Thank you for saying that much more clear. That was wonderful.
I think people need to understand that difference, and I think that you elaborated on that in excellent fashion. One thing I think that sticks out to me in these little attacks that we have seen, and you brought up as well as attacks against Saudi Arabia, oil facilities, is also the way they're utilizing these attacks, what they're doing by sending drones, some missiles, speedboats at times on the Gulf itself. And I want to specifically look at the Saudi Arabia because for anyone that looks, I guess, from a larger lens and historical lens at the Middle East, will look at Saudi Arabia and Israel as two competing allies of the United States. Saudi Arabia being its #1 Gulf ally for many, many reasons, Israel being its number one ally for other reasons in the Middle East. We've never had real official relations or peace with Saudi Arabia. Israel has also never been at war with Saudi Arabia. We must clarify that. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize when they hear peace accords between the Gulf states or Saudi Arabia and Israel. We weren't in a state of war with these nations. We just didn't have relations and maybe considered each other not friendly with one another. But there was never a state of war like there is vis-a-vis Syria. So I think that's also something that needs to be taken into consideration. But everyone knows that the United States backs Saudi Arabia, that the United States is allies with the Saudis. They have been friends since World War II. And why does it seem, at least, that the United States doesn't have the Saudis back when it comes to now their fight with the Houthis in Yemen, which is clearly funded by Iranian interests, clearly funded with Iranian arms and money and oil. And we see the Western world, the media, attack Saudi Arabia for defending its interests in Yemen, but also no one is jumping to the defense of Saudi Arabia when the biggest oil facility on the planet is attacked by terrorists, in essence. Why is
Well,
that? What has
Etai,
shifted?
yeah. Etai, I'm not going to help you out here because I'm not a fan of Saudi Arabia. And so I'm going to put it out there to perhaps give a little bit of context, and that does have to do with viewpoint and framing and that change in US administration. And I would say things that have happened between Canada and Saudi Arabia, between different European countries and Saudi Arabia. I would say that there are two competing countries for the most conservative, harsh regimes in the world. One of them we all know to say Iran. And guess what? The other one is Saudi Arabia. And so MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the son of the king, wants to open up Saudi Arabia. And I'm like, really? Look carefully. They're going from being very, 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 if I could add some more, conservative, to just being very, 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 very. So women can now drive. They still have to drive together with a chaperone. You still have totally separate, go into a McDonald's and you have the women's section and the men's section. That's in Saudi Arabia, not in Iran. People get their hands chopped off if they stole, and women are stoned to death for adultery. In Saudi Arabia, not just in Iran. So when we're talking about the country of Saudi Arabia, what it stands for, human rights, let alone freedoms, Saudi Arabia is very strong competition for the Islamic regime of Iran. Put it on the table. What's the difference?
Fair's
Saudi
fair. That's
Arabia
definitely true.
supported, in its own way, supported the West, okay, was in its very own conservative way, never went against the West, and it has those enormous oil and gas reserves. And that's there. And Aramco, the Arab American oil company, the pipelines, we all needed that. What changed in that sense when you say with not backing Saudi Arabia against Yemen? Yemen is a world crisis. It's going to bite the world in its own way. I say it's going to bite the world. Right now, it's just biting Saudi Arabia. It could bite Oman because it's at the end of the world. Who cares? People will care when out of Yemen, rockets are fired onto that enormous shipping lane that then ends up in the Suez Canal and then gets stuck by one cargo ship. But that passes near Yemen, right? And so the battle in Yemen does matter. And I'm not saying I'm like, it's not like I'm for Iran, but Saudi Arabian tactics in that battle have not been a goysa mitzia, something to write home about. And so it is that combination. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? Why is Saudi Arabia not being backed? Because they are doing what Russia did in Syria. And we all called Russia out on that, but we're not calling Saudi Arabia out on that. And again, it's against Yemen Houthis who are supported by Iranians, absolutely, and Shiites, but there are also people there. How do you balance it out? How do you decide where you are? Is the geopolitical interest of having Saudi Arabia pro-West while killing the Yemenites in this horrible crisis, but keep Yemen stable? Who said the geopolitics is simple? And one of those aspects here right now is, in that sense, trying to get the Iranians out of backing the Houthis without allowing and enabling the Saudis to really do what we were so critical about. It's mass bombing against enormous targets in Yemen, where you're more killing people and destroying cities than really doing anything against the Iranian influence.
So would you say then, just I guess specifically looking at the Yemen situation, ending on your note there, that this is a tactical mistake, that they are not fighting their battle correctly, the war in Yemen is not being fought correctly, or is it a moral situation at the end of the day that it doesn't matter what Saudi were to do tactically, bomb entire cities or bomb strategically the way Israel does in Gaza, if you will, that the world would still turn against Saudi Arabia and be in favor of the Houthis and Iran. As we saw right now, the Houthis have been de-designated as a terrorist organization. I'm not sure why that was, outside of geopolitical reasoning, to send another hand over to Iran and be like, here, we're trying to appease you in some way. I completely agree with you about Saudi Arabia. There is no doubt they are one of the most oppressive regimes on the planet, always have been. But that's what I'm trying to get, is they haven't changed. That was like that in 1990. It was like that in 1980 and 70 and 60, et cetera, and even worse then. But for some
And
reason, the West was friends with them. And now it seems at a time where really divisions and allies need to be set straight. The West is leaving Saudi in the cold, which could be for the good, could be for the bad, but it will leave a vacuum of some sort, be it China coming in to claim Saudi Arabian oil and be friends with them, or Iran taking over regional areas.
so I don't see the Saudis. I think that, okay, I'll start otherwise. The Sauds, what most interests the Sauds is the Sauds, not the Saudi people, but the Saud regime that it's a very elaborate, complicated, thousands of royal family. You think that the British royal family is complicated? Go to Saudi Arabia, okay?
Most
In
definitely.
their system. And I want to remind all of us that they just changed their system. And part of what's going on, together with everything else, is that under King Salman, who only came to power a few years ago, he changed the royal system in Saudi Arabia. It used to go from brother to brother to brother. And boy, are there still a lot of brothers there that are alive and well. And after that, it was supposed to go to the oldest son of the oldest brother, who himself is older than King Salman, but it was very complicated. And King Salman said, okay, ending that one, it's going to go to my firstborn.
Right.
And that is a huge change within the Saudi system. And Mohammed bin Salman is changing Saudi Arabia, or trying to do some changes so that the Sauds will be with him. They're very conservative. He has that mixture there between that very conservative actually comes out also of the people, not necessarily out of the royalty at all. So it's catering to a country that wants to be a little bit more open in a Muslim conservative way. But as I said, when you compare conservative Saudi Arabia to conservative Shiite Iran, I know I'm saying something impossible, but if you ask me as a woman, I'm not sure. I actually think that I would have more rights as a woman, I'm positive, in Iran by far than in Saudi Arabia. And that's half the population. So why then with the West? Because he took steps. You open up the steps, and then he went and arrested human rights activists. It's like within Saudi Arabia, they said, oh, he's taking steps. And then for them, it was like taking too many steps, closing it down. It isn't clear, it isn't concise. And this has nothing to do with Yemen. With Yemen, you know what? Yemen to me is one of those dismal places on earth that it's all about location, location, location. Should I remind all of our listeners that until 1960 something, it was with a British protectorate. I mean, again, it was a country and a kingdom, but Aden was the prize. You know, it's so part of the colonial endeavor and imperialism in general, and all because of its location. Nobody cares about the mountains, okay? Everybody cares about that port, which is at the entrance to get to the Suez Canal. And so nowadays, you know, we look at it and wonder how to do with that. I don't think that the Yemenites can conquer Saudi Arabia, but they bug them, they annoy them, they're in their back, and the Iranians are there. And then it becomes part of those regional geopolitics, without the United States, without China, without Russia, just the regional geopolitics of the Shiites versus the Sunni, of the Sauds against the Iranians and Etai, we all have to remember, next week, Ramadan starts. And when it's not about the Hajj, okay, that'll be a bit later, but not that much later. But the Hajj will come after that. But Ramadan and the month of fasting, and that's for all the Muslims worldwide. But every Muslim holiday always reminds us all again that the two holy cities are in Saudi Arabia. And they get to choose if on an Umrah or a Hajj, if going on a holy pilgrimage to those two holy cities, you do get to come or you don't get to come. And that's like Muslim geopolitics.
Right.
So, and that also adds in.
And that plays a role, no doubt. Just to continue along this line of questioning, we'll move away from Saudi Arabia and go into one of the United States' favorite backyards, Iraq. And they have been there for the last 20 years. They've also were there the first Gulf War. We know the history between the United States inside Iraq. What I find very interesting is the lack of United States response, or maybe I'm just not seeing it properly, and maybe you can open my eyes to the response if there has been one, to rocket attacks against US bases that have killed and injured US servicemen as well as US contractors. And we can just say US citizens in general have been attacked, injured, hurt, and killed, men, women, whoever is on these bases. And we have seen a lack of response when we know full well that it is coming ordered by Iranian regime to its militias in Iraq to shoot rockets, as we have seen their militias in Gaza do towards Israel. No difference. Hence why we have heard the Iron Dome is being shipped to Iraq. The Americans have bought a couple to put near their bases. Why is the American, we know why Israel responds the way it does, but why is the American response, the number one military in the world, the strongest military in the world, such a weak response to attacks that have killed its service members and citizens?
My answer is one that I upfront am saying, everybody swallow deep. It's 2021. The United States of America over the last year has lost so many of its citizens to a pandemic called COVID-19 that when you look at the list of issues that need to be addressed, and you go, but this is a different one, it's security, it's military, and I'm going, it's United States of America priorities. It's called, we need to first vaccinate ourselves, heal ourselves, let alone talk about the rhetoric of the last elections, the results of the last elections. And the question is, do you need to add into it the exact same immediate, obvious response to every single attack? I'm posing it as a question mark. Is that a policy? Do you have to respond to every attack? Israel does, okay? We will not leave open attacks unanswered. And I think that Israel has very quietly, but overwhelmingly done lots of attacks where we just don't take responsibility. The United States of America has enormous assets in the Middle East, in the Gulf areas, in Saudi Arabia, in Iraq, for that matter, in Afghanistan. But in the United States priority of 2021, do what they want to have happen right now is a type of escalation, meaning you don't have to respond every time. Does that enable or strengthen the Iranians? Etai, it goes back to the question that we asked about way at the beginning. There are different ways of looking at the policy, okay? The Iranians want to show they're strong. Do you have to show them that they're not to come back to the table? Will that make better negotiations? Depends who you ask. I think that the Iranians are very good negotiators. And one of the things that they're trying to say very clearly is that we are stating clearly in Iraq and in Yemen and in Syria, as we've just mentioned this all over the place before, that we're not leaving any of those places. And that when we come to the table, assuming we do, about the nuclear issue, these other issues are not coming onto the table with it, which, by the way, is one of the things that Israel has always been very critical about, that the Iranian export of terrorism was never part of the nuclear deal. Having said that, does anybody want to see a nuclear Iran? If you can arrive at a deal which maybe could delay nuclear Iran, don't you want to be on board? Are you going to feel better if you don't arrive at any kind of agreement and they go nuclear? I'm like, it's again, there is no easy, as I said, that recipe that everybody's looking for. If you follow that, then you arrive at a beautiful chocolate cake. Doesn't work in geopolitics.
Now, would you say that that's a product of 2021, as you mentioned, due to the pandemic? Is that a product of American weariness to get into more battle hardened areas inside the Middle East where they're trying to leave many years of war behind? Is this a product of the domestic nature of the United States, the people there not wanting to be involved anymore in these types of situations? Or is this American policy pulling back also from the Middle East as a whole, as shifting towards the Pacific and China?
It's probably a combination of all of the above, but I'm going to highlight the priorities of the United States of America, which to my ear, as I listen from the side, is first and foremost, and I'm saying it in the terms of heal thyself on so many different levels, where geopolitics, because it's such a drastic change between the Trump administration and what he stood for, both in foreign policy, in geopolitics, and domestically, so that it's about which leaders were called first after the new administration, who was appointed to the different positions, but nothing active is going on. It's mainly right now about what are we doing at home? How do we contend with that? Going to Atlanta to a shootout, or maybe going to Colorado, it's like issues of domestic aspects and not of responding. I agree, the United States has by far the strongest military, but I'm going to ask again in that question, and do we want to cut back on that? Do we want to use the money for something else right now? I mean, I don't have answers to that questions. I think that these are exactly the changes that in March, and I listen every time President Biden, when he talks and in his words, and as he speaks and through the different advisors, and I can't yet tell you how I see US policy, but I definitely can tell you that the priorities are in the United States and not throughout the world. I don't know that it's more in the Pacific or China or Russia, but look at what he just said to Russia. I mean, in that sense, as I'm saying, but it's not in that sense of, okay, every single place on earth where they kill US citizens, as you said, we are immediately going to respond. And part of that is within that location of Iran, of the Middle East, it's saying, okay, because they could afterwards come and do some kind of response. Of all of the 4 years of the Trump administration, I am going to send my great, for me, Miri, as an Israeli, this is my opinion, my great admiration for the killing of Qasem Soleimani. To me, that was harsh, correct. That was the way to go. And everything that Iran is doing since is nothing compared to that. And it isn't about comparing administrations, okay? That was done a year and 2 months ago, okay? That was the game changer. And so the little aspects of it are happening now. And my heart goes out to any person killed, any citizen killed. Priorities in geopolitics and domestic politics are going to impact those kind of responses also, as they do in Israel,
And we have kept you on for so long on this episode. We appreciate it so much. I have one last question for you. As I mentioned earlier, it's something that I wanted to get to at the end and sort of wrap up our conversation, is this latest pact, 25-year pact between China and Iran. What does that pact have, or what does that pact affect specifically in the Middle East? How does that affect Israel? How does it affect the global geopolitics? But most of all, how does that affect a potential nuclear accord? As we know, China is an original signatory to the JCPOA. They are a veto member at the UN Security Council. They carry, obviously, the weight of China behind them. So an actual 25-year signed pact with Iran must have some ramifications on the outlook of how to approach nuclear negotiations and how to approach Iran as a whole.
China is an economic power. I have surprised nobody.
No.
China uses its economic power as its geopolitical tool. China signed a 25 agreement with Iran. All of our wonderful listeners, go look at the map of Africa and find out where China has signed agreements with every single country in Africa that has something worthwhile that China could use economically.
Rare earth
China is
metals.
willing to China is willing to step in to where they can with their economic power, and Iran is happy to do so. China is not necessarily willing to stand up and to do, meaning their hard power is the economic power. Yes, they are nuclear. Yes, they are in the 5-member nuclear official club. Having said that, they are already in the Middle East. They are building ports in Israel. They are all over the place. And I have an expectation, Etai, we'll talk another time, that China will probably be one of the powers, economic powers, to rebuild the broken Syria. Who else would do it if not China? But specifically, this pact is for Iran. Iran wants it right now. I think that it does not make any impact on the nuclear negotiations. I think that Iran wants all of us to think that, China has its back. China, for anybody listening, has China's back.
I think that's the most apropos way to say it, and that is China has China's back and looks only for its self-interest at the end of the day, and would help whatever nation so long as there was something in return for them, economically, militarily, whatever it may be. And I think it's something that worth mentioning, as you did, is that China does have its fingers in every part of the world that has some economic interest to them, has natural resources that are in need of. And, for 15 years or so, people were not really paying attention, but China's deals with these African countries that you mentioned were very interesting the way they made those deals. They signed to build the infrastructure of these countries that had no infrastructure in return to taking their rare earth metals
Absolutely.
and resources. But those countries really, at some point, really had no more choice. They are in debt to the Western world, a lot of them were, and had no way to build the infrastructure to get their commodities to the coast or to the air in any way anyway. And China took advantage of that. And maybe someone will start to realize what is happening vis-a-vis China in the Middle East as they try to do that now in Tehran and build this 25-year pact with them and see where that goes.
If I can say one more thing
Please.
about that, when you opened up at the beginning and you said Iran, Israel, air, sea, land, I want to add 2 additional things that come together with China. One is economic. We don't think of that, but I don't think of it as warfare, but it is a battleground. It is one where we need to take note of what the impact is, and that's part of what's going on. And the additional one that we didn't say is cyber. And in that sense, just add that in, both with China, let alone with Iran, and you see the multi-dimensional, all of these different fronts that Israel needs to face, that the West needs to face. And when we say counterterrorism, we should add in that sense that people remember economic, financial, let alone cyber, because they certainly add into that.
Most definitely summed up very well. Thank you so much. Colonel retired Miri Eisen joining our program here, Counterterrorism Today, the ICT's premier podcast. I want to thank you so much for being on the program, and we hope to have you on soon. It was sobering, enlightening, and extremely very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, stay safe and be healthy.